Hi guys, this is Aditya Anand and I'm back with another tutorial in our series to achieve some wisdom related to VRA automation. And this time we will be discussing how authentication is done in VRA, the different cloud layers in VRA automation, and then we will throw some light on the concept of multi-tenancy. As you already know from our components of VRA automation tutorial, there is a VMware Identity Manager or VIDM component running inside the virtual appliance, which is responsible to provide authentication in case of VRA. From VRA version 7.x and later, the VIDM component comes integrated into the virtual appliance. Before version 7.x though, the authentication was provided by the VMware vCenter single sign-on, which was installed on a separate appliance than the VRA appliance and used a vPostgres database of its own. Now, these complicated things a bit in the sense that if you wanted to scale out your solution and provide high availability, you must deploy 4 appliances, 2 for VRA core and 2 for single sign-on. While now you can achieve the same level of high availability in just 2 appliances, as the VIDM component resides inside the virtual appliance and uses the same vPostgres database as VRA core. And when we scale out the virtual appliance, it scales out in lockstep with it. Now that we are all caught up and have already revised what we already know, let us dig a bit deeper and try to understand what other improvements and features are provided by VIDM component. The VMware Identity Manager is much more stable than the previous SSO appliance and also provides support for multi-tenancy. The VIDM syncs the users and groups from Active Directory and keeps a copy locally. So whenever a user tries to log in, it searches them locally instead of searching them in the AD, what SSO appliance used to do. This significantly reduces login times, although the authentication will still take place against the Active Directory. The VMware Identity Manager supports multiple authentication methods, some of which were not previously supported, such as username and password, Kerberos authentication, SAML token authentication, smart card and certificate authentication, RSA adaptive authentication, and others. If you don't know what these are, you need not to worry. These are just the ways by which you can be authenticated by the Identity Manager. Then again, if you absolutely need to know what they are and have an unquenchable thirst for knowledge, you can always Google them. The VIDM authentication methods are built using an extensible framework, so that if in the near future a newer framework is required, it can be developed and plugged into the VIDM. VIDM also supports the creation of local users. These users' credentials are saved locally in the VIDM database. They're needed in case the connectivity to the AD goes down. You will still be able to log into the VRA portal as the authentication will be carried out locally by the VMware Identity Manager. The first tenant administrator account created for a new tenant must be a local user. Now, there are many other features associated with VIDM that we absolutely need to know. The first one is that it provides support for multi-tenancy. That is, each tenant can have its own synced users and groups, synced from the AD defined in that tenant. So each tenant has its own authentication groups going on completely segregated from other tenants. Just so that you have a basic understanding, a tenant represents an organizational unit. We will make the whole concept of tenants much clearer in the later part of this video. Another feature provided by VMware Identity Manager is branding. You can customize the look and feel of each tenant, which includes background images, company logos, etc. This gives a proper at-home feel to each client. VIDM also supports multi-factor authentication. That means that you can use multiple methods of authentication that are independent to each other together to verify the user's identity. You can sync a single AD to multiple tenants or a single tenant to multiple ADs. You can also sync a part of or the whole Active Directory. The syncing of AD can be done manually or on a schedule. The Active Directory users or group attributes that are synced from Active Directory are selected by an administrator when the tenant is being configured. The selective syncing means that VRA 7 has the ability to set up approvals based on the synced attributes. That finishes up our how authentication is achieved in VRA topic. So let's move on to the next item on our bucket list, and that will be the cloud layers existing in the VRA infrastructure. It's important that we cover up this topic before we move on to understand tenants and multi-tenancy. We have loosely divided our whole VRA environment into 5 parts for easy understanding and segregation, and have called each individual part a cloud layer. So guys, the first layer is going to be your infrastructure. It is just a bunch of resources coming from endpoints, which can be from your virtualized servers or from public cloud endpoints. Essentially, this is the infrastructure that you're managing with VRA. Next up in layers, we have the infrastructure fabric. The underlying infrastructure is aggregated in the form of a fabric. In order to work with these resources, you will have to configure the endpoints, which store the connection information along with the required credentials for communication with these endpoints. The third cloud layer is the fabric group. It divides the infrastructure fabric into smaller parts. This makes your complete infrastructure more manageable. A fabric group corresponds to compute resources such as vSphere clusters. Fabric groups can be further divided into reservations, which are used to identify the resources into a more fine-grained fashion, such as CPU, memory, disk, and network. Layer 4 will be the tenant level. In a large multi-tenant environment, each tenant can be a company or a subdivision of that company. Each tenant configures its own Active Directory for user account management. You can use the default tenant to manage system-wide configurations. The last cloud layer is the business group. They are a subdivision of tenants, and their relationship is analogous to the relationship between fabric group and reservations. They are created to group users of the self-service portal for the ease of management. Here, a business group can be an organizational unit, such as a team. Each reservation created in a fabric group is mapped to a business group that allows them to utilize the resources of that particular reservation. Finally, if we were to compile all of the layers discussed in this tutorial, this is how a complete picture will look like. At the bottom, we have the infrastructure, which is aggregated in the form of fabric, which are then divided in the form of fabric groups and are further divided into reservations for ease of manageability. Then we have the logical segregations called tenants, which are divided into business groups, and the reservations that were created earlier are attached to them. Now, that was all we had to say about the different cloud layers, and it's time to shift our focus towards multi-tenancy. You have already heard the word tenant quite a few times in this series, and also that VRLS automation supports multi-tenancy. So let's throw some light over what is meant and why we are using the term multi-tenancy. The easiest way to understand multi-tenancy is by the overused and yet extremely powerful and cliched example of an apartment building. The way an apartment building can have multiple tenants living on different floors, isolated from each other, while still utilizing the common infrastructure and some common features like electricity, water, and gas pipeline. Similarly, the tenants in our VRA's automation environment are also logically separated and isolated from each other while still sharing the same infrastructure. They are built for the resources that they consume, just like the tenants in an apartment building are built for the resources that they consume over the electricity and the water and the gas pipeline. And the tenants are not responsible for maintaining the infrastructure. Now, this brings our tutorial to an end. We'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.